What's ahead for the global economy in 2022? Hello, I'm Arnold Snyder, and this is The Heat. As the world continues to battle the COVID-19 pandemic, how will economies around the world perform this year? Will China see more strong growth, and how much of a ripple effect will its performance have on other economies in Asia and beyond? What about the United States? Will its major new funding for infrastructure kick in, or could inflation halt America's economic progress in 2022? Well, we have a great panel to weigh in on all of this. Joining us now from Tel Aviv is John Gong. He is a professor of economics at the University of International Business and Economics in Beijing. With us here in Washington, D.C. is Jeff Moon. He is president of China Moon Strategies, and he served as assistant U.S. trade representative for China during the Obama administration. Also joining us from London is Klisman Murati. He is the founder of Pareto Economics, a global affairs research consultancy. And from Portland, Oregon with us is Yan Liang. She is a professor of economics at Willamette University. Thank you, everyone, for being with us. John Gong, let me start with you. Of course, there's a big focus on how the Chinese economy will perform in 2022. There's been some analyses that have been published. Morgan Stanley, the investment bank, thinks that growth could be better than expected. The Financial Times, however, says that it thinks that Chinese growth has actually peaked. So what do you think? What's the outlook for the Chinese economy in 2022?
Well, before we talk about 2022, we haven't seen the figures for the fourth quarter of last year yet, 2021. And I think the surprise is that this COVID thing, it just keeps hitting China here and there. And I think it has some prospect of snowballing to something that's quite difficult to control. And I think that's the most important uncertainty here. And I think in the fourth quarter, I think definitely we're going to see a GDP growth figure that's going to be slower than third quarter. But on average, I think there might be a chance that it will hit 8% for 2021. But I think at the very least, it should be around that. I think it may be a little bit lower than that. Now, moving forward onto 2022, I think there's a lot of talk about the current Omicron phenomenon is an indication of the beginning of the end. And if that's the case, we will see very strong quarters in the latter of the year. But I think the first quarter of 2022 will be kind of similar to the fourth quarter of 2021 because we're getting into the winter season. And I think the zero tolerance policy with China in China is going to continue. And then it's inevitably going to have an impact on the economy, especially the service sector. So I think I'm going to give you an answer with a mixed bag of good news and bad news. I think the bad news is that the first quarter looks like to be a continuation of the fourth quarter last year. And I think there's a prospect that things will come back pretty strongly as this COVID thing is receding. I think towards the second half of the year, probably going to see pretty strong growth.
Right. John, just one point on COVID. I mean, we have seen isolated cases in China. It's recurred in certain places. But do you think it is still going to impact growth?
Well, I think there are some indications that this Omicron variant is very contagious, and it's very difficult to contain it. I think the measures taken by the Chinese government has been really, really rigorous and very strict. But you still see constant news of this city has seen new cases, that city has seen new cases. So I'm starting to be a little bit skeptical about whether the control can be 100% successful, actually, to be honest with you. So I think that's a very, very strong uncertainty there. And I actually have faith in the Chinese government. They know what they're doing, and the track record has been pretty good. But this virus is just too strong, So I think that's the biggest uncertainty here.
Jeff Moon, here in the United States, inflation continues to be a big concern. I mean, inflation reached its highest level in 30 years at the end of 2021. What do you see ahead for the US economy in 2022? Will it continue its rebound, or will inflation in some respects put the brakes on that?
I think the answer is yes. I think both of those things are going to happen. Inflation was up to 6.8% last year, but the Federal Reserve has already signaled it's going to raise rates. It's going to cut its bond purchasing. I see that Morningstar, for example, thinks that inflation in 2022 will drop to 3%, which is much better, and average only, say, 2.2% between 2022 and 2025. So there's reason for optimism on that score. But it's also here a mixed picture, just like John described. We're very concerned about the virus here because it affects everything that goes on in the economy, and all kinds of economic activities are suddenly and surprisingly interrupted. Inflation is also a problem here. But I think, both of these factors are global factors. I mean, and they impact different regions in different ways. For example, we talked about the virus in China. The Eurasia Group, the New York-based risk consultancy, highlights the possibility of Omicron in China as its greatest risk of 2022 because China has done such a good job of controlling the virus that people don't have natural immunity, and the Chinese vaccines don't seem to be completely effective in controlling the newest and most dangerous virus that's there. So this is something that's different in the United States. We already are affected by it here. It could affect things in a very surprising way in China as well. And so, I think this is the most difficult year to predict over, say, the past decade as to what's going to happen because of all the contingencies.
And Jeff, looking at inflation and the Fed's response to it, traders expect a very aggressive response from the Fed, and we've seen that today. The Dow dropped more than 400 points. So is it, to some extent, being factored in already?
I think it is, but if you've been watching the market, I mean, it's been going up and down hundreds of points every day. So 400 points today sounds like a lot, but it's not that unique in terms of what's been happening. And I think that some of that news from the Fed was being factored in. But there is concern about inflation. I think most people think that the Fed, both raising rates and tapering a bit, is probably the right thing to do. So I'm not particularly concerned about that.
Okay, let's go to London, to Klisman Murati. Klisman, great to have you with us. What is the outlook in Europe? I mean, we're seeing projections of 4% growth, but could that be undercut again by COVID, as well as, the restrictions being put in place by various governments?
It seems as if the issues that Europe faces are the issues that the world faces right now. COVID has been something which has taken over the world, and the repercussions of COVID have hit, in macro terms, very similarly, and Europe is no exception. So we have, the one thing that I think we need to consider when talking about growth, economic growth for 2022 in any region, but you asked me about Europe, is to really differentiate the real economy to the financial economy, because they have been digressing for a long time, especially since COVID has hit. Financial economy has actually seen particularly, strong gains in the stock market, but the real economy has seen decimations of companies. It's seen people out of work, furloughed, and this has not really slowed up as much, although governments have tried their best to curb these downturns. But we have the case now for the real economy of higher taxes, of inflation, of more expensive commodities like gas to heat your homes, especially over this winter period, which is only going to increase, I think, into the next year. So households themselves need to be able to budget with tighter incomes. They need to be able to also, be able to spend on demands that don't stop. And this is going to remain to be difficult into the new year. As to what the central bank does to curb this, raising interest rates, this could help in ways, but I think the focus should really be on the real economy and how these policies impact the real economy, as opposed to only really focusing on macro growth trends, which for a dentist in Germany or for a teacher in Albania, for example, it affects them in two very different ways.
Yan Liang, I want to get your view on the threat we're seeing from COVID, and especially the threat and how it affects the Chinese economy. I mean, China is taking very tough measures. In fact, we just heard recently that it put an entire city of 1 million people on lockdown after just 3 or 4 cases were found of the Omicron variant. Here in the US, of course, the Omicron variant is rampant. But how big a role could that play in impacting the Chinese economy? And also, we've seen the impact it's had on global supply chains. I mean, will that continue?
Well, thank you for having me, Anand. So I think, yes, the Chinese economy is still pretty much affected by the Omicron variant to a very great extent because, as Beijing has realized that 2020 will face, the so-called triple pressures. There is the, demand constraint, and largely because of, COVID restrictions and the uncertainty about jobs and incomes, as well as some regulatory crackdowns on the high-tech sector and also the real estate. So all of these could drag on the demand side. And for supply, I think similar story about, COVID restrictions could disrupt supply chain within China. And finally, the low expectations, again, that has largely to do with, people's uncertainty about the COVID and also the policy reactions to that. So I think COVID is very much still affecting China's economy. And in the US, of course, we have seen, like you said, rampant COVID. But I think the economic reactions in terms of policies and economic activities have become much less sensitive, I think, to COVID. But that said, I think the US economy is still not out of the woods, of course, due to labor shortages, supply chain constraints. And I really don't think raising the interest rates or tapering off monetary easing would help very much because all these are trying to depress the demand side. But the real problem with inflation has to do with the supply side. So raising interest rate could only add to the business cost and reduce, production and expansion. And that would, to my view, worsen inflation. That said, I think in China, there has been a consensus that after the Winter Olympics, after the People's Congress in March, there may be some easing in COVID restrictions, but that remains to be seen. But China's economy still, I think, remains strong because there could still be, strong export demand, accommodative, fiscal support,
right.
Relief and transparent regulations on the real estates and other sectors. And I think also, some slightly relaxed approach to carbon reduction and power crunch. So all these could help China's economy to recover and grow.
John Gong, just one point on the Chinese vaccination program. And we've seen China take very stringent action to combat the spread of the virus. But what can you tell us about the vaccination program and how effective it has been?
Well, the vaccination program is being quite aggressively deployed. I think the population in China that have been vaccinated, the very large percentage of the population. But the problem is as somebody, I think you have also mentioned, that these vaccines are probably not as effective as the Pfizer one, for example, the Moderna one. Now, let me point out this. I think at this point, none of the vaccines can claim that they can prevent infection with respect to the Omicron variant. But I think the vaccines are effective in terms of mitigating the symptoms, making life a lot easier for people. And I think Chinese vaccines also have the same properties. Maybe not as effective in that regard, but we don't have a lot of data yet because we haven't seen a lot of cases in China for the people who have been vaccinated in China with the Chinese vaccine. So probably don't have a very good answer to that, but it appears that I think that the things that I read seem to indicate that might be the case. However, I think what the Chinese lack in the medical field is probably more compensated by government policies and strict measures to combat this variant. I think the government, as I said, it does have a track record of containing this if all the resources and all the measures governments can mobilize.
Right.
So I'm pretty confident in that. Now, I do want to add a note to the impact on export side. We have to keep in mind that so far these mini outbreaks in many cities in China haven't really affected the manufacturing side. I think the impact is mostly on the service sector, on consumption maybe. But Chinese exports, in my view, for 2022 will continue to be very strong, especially I think in areas associated with new energy and climate change stuff. I mean, if you look at the exports of electric cars from China, it's actually growing very fast. These are very big ticket items. Each car exported $20,000, $30,000. These cars are seen everywhere in Europe and here in Israel as well from China. So, I'm still very have a rosy picture of China's exports next year, even though it has very great growth last year, 2021.
Right. Jeff Moon, in the United States, towards the end of last year, we saw that massive $1.2 trillion infrastructure bill passed by the United States Congress. What impact will it have once it starts kicking in?
It's going to have a long-term impact because it covers a variety of infrastructure things and projects, bridges, rail transportation, other kinds of transportation, broadband, airports, roads, all those kinds of things. And it was passed, 1.2 trillion was passed at the end of the year, but it's going to take years to roll out. It's going to take quite some time. Anybody that's been in an area where there is mass construction of roads or things like that knows that doesn't happen in a day. It's going to take a while. And that's probably a good thing because $1.2 trillion is quite a shot in the arm into the economy that would tend to encourage inflation. But if it's drawn out over a period of years, that inflation impact would be mitigated somewhat. So I think it'll take a while for everyone to see it, but the impact is real, and people in the U.S. welcome it.
Klisman, in Europe, of course, we are seeing that this is a time of change. We've just seen a change in leadership in Germany. The French will go to the elections for a new president very soon, and of course, Brexit is not yet settled. It's still bedding down. What kind of impact will all of this have in Europe?
In short, a lot, but to be more specific, I think you can see not only the elections in Germany, but Portugal had presidential elections, Kosovo had elections, Albania had elections, Bulgaria had elections. So the election cycle for 2021 is active, as it will be. 2022 is no different. I think the major, hubs in Europe where elections have more of an impact across Europe as opposed to regionally or within the country itself is Germany, France, mostly, and other periphery countries in sort of the Western Europe. You're right in that. But I think the issues that we're facing now as a human race, given COVID, politics doesn't really have different perspectives, political perspectives of how to deal with it. Because all political parties want to make sure that the people are protected, that jobs are secured, that healthcare is secured. So we are no longer living in sort of, I think, a left versus right wing sort of political system, especially when it comes time to responses to COVID. So that's one very key thing. Talking about Brexit also, I think COVID came at a very unusual time with Brexit because I think it's hard to see the effects or what the effects of Brexit would have been clean without COVID as a variable on supply chains, for example. And these two things, COVID and Brexit, the impacts have happened around the same time. So the issues that the UK is facing currently, and I'm in London, and we hear this all the time, and the new year will be a new stage of the Brexit negotiations coming to be. So we'll see a lot of impacts there. But I don't think we can really understand how big of an impact Brexit would have if COVID wasn't a factor too. For example, things like employment and shortage of staff. Naturally, with the COVID, this has been the case. How much of a impact would this have been without COVID? Again, that reality hasn't been lived. But Europe has, and I think will continue to be strong into the new year. Europe and the EU as a body have a lot of things to deal with, the migration crisis, the Balkan nations wanting accession and the talks happening there, foreign policy with the United States, with China, with Russia is still going to be on the table for the new year. We see, things happening in Kazakhstan. Afghanistan hasn't gone away, although it's probably gone away from the headlines. Belarus is still up there. NATO is still up there. So a lot of things that Europe will be contesting into the new year. But I see strength, at least with the economy, as much as they can. And in the political sphere, they're going to have to adapt.
Yan Liang, of course, there is a big cloud that is sitting over the global economy, and that's the cloud which is the trade dispute between the United States and China. Do you see anything changing?
Well, we certainly hope so. I think, if anything, this trade war has proved to be so counterproductive to the United States economy. As we talked about, the U.S. is, fighting with inflation, and lowering that tariff rates would be first very effective measure because that would reduce the import costs for the United States. And on top of that, with all the infrastructure spending and creating more jobs and supply, that would also help to tame the inflationary pressure. Not to mention the infrastructure spending would help, the U.S. economy to grow by 0.4 percentage points in 2022. So I think the point here is that fighting a trade war is not going to help the United States to regain its economic prominence. As Ryan Haas has written in his book, Stronger, what the U.S. really needs to do in win the competition against China is to really reinvest itself. And $1.2 trillion in infrastructure spending is sounding a lot, but it actually really is not sufficient for the United States to revamp its infrastructure deficits. And same thing for China. I think 2021 has seen slower growth in infrastructure spending, and I think that should really increase not only to support green energy infrastructures and many other tech infrastructures, digital infrastructures. So that would provide that demand push in the short term, but also help productivity growth in the long term. So I think for both countries, the strategy is really to reinvest in their own economy instead of fighting this very counterproductive trade war that reduce production, that reduce productivity, that heightened price growth, and so on and so forth.
Right, Jeff Moon, what do you make of that? That the United States really has to reinvest in itself. And of course, $1.2 trillion is a lot of money to you and me, but in terms of a national rejuvenation, not that much.
I agree with much of what was just said. And if this were a purely economic matter, that would be the end of it. But it's not. The trade war was as much a political matter as it was an economic matter. And the fact is that China made commitments that it did not live up to. And the biggest threats to U.S.-China economic relations are both that failure to purchase more than 60% of what it promised to do, compounded by President Biden's failure to develop a China's trade strategy in his first year that will allow the two countries to engage. So the politics of this, we're living in a zero sum and a zero trust environment. And I think China's failure to deliver on promises that it made internationally, compounded with its failure to meet other promises that it's made in recent years, I think are a almost insurmountable problem. We're in a stalemate, unfortunately, and it's going to be very hard to come out of it and address this as an economic issue, which I sure wish that we would do.
Yeah.
On both sides.
All right, John Gong, did China make commitments that it could not fulfill?
Say that again. I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch your question.
Did China, when we look at the trade dispute between the United States and China, did China make commitments to the United States in terms of, let's say, its imports that it would get from the United States that it could not really fulfill?
Okay, so yeah, officially China is still on the record of committing to its obligations in the second phase, the second year of the first phase trade deal. We haven't seen the numbers yet. We don't know, to what extent China's commitment to the purchases have been fully fulfilled. But I think this has also been, largely affected by the COVID. This has been largely affected by the energy prices. It's been largely affected by the dollar depreciation, for example. All of these things probably, contribute to the prospect of maybe short of the full purchase commitment. Now, regarding the trade war, I want to point out one thing. Catherine Tai, the USTR, is supposedly going through a process of processing applications for exemptions of the tariffs.
Right.
I'm pretty sure that a lot of companies are applying for that. And to what extent the tariffs has been removed or at least mitigated, that we don't know. But I suspect actually for many companies in the United States, the tariff burden has indeed been relieved a lot.
Right.
So I hold my belief out there that the trade war, to some extent, is already seeding, I think.
Yeah.
Thanks very much to Catherine's process.
All right. I know Yan Liang wants to say something on that. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think, it's really a self-defeatist kind of rhetoric just to say this is all about politics. And so that's the end of the discussion. I think, no matter what Democratic Party does in terms of, trade policies with China per se, the Republicans are not going to be happy about it. They will keep up the rhetoric about being tough on China. So I think at the end of the day, I wish the Biden administration can really just put that politics aside and do what is right, for the economy, for the people. And that might actually help to garner support, when people see the economy thriving, jobs are returning, and jobs are being created, and inflation is tamed down. I think that would really help with the political career, right, and the political landscape for the Democratic Party. And also, I think one point about China is not delivering its promise in terms of purchase agreements. Well, we all know COVID, right, was happening, and that not only disrupt the demand side, but more importantly, the supply side. And China has made a lot of commitments in terms of agriculture products purchases. So, and when it comes to energy, for example, the price is down for the most part, before this year. So there are a lot of difficulties. Not only, it's not a lack of China's commitment, but all these realities, made it difficult to fulfill that purchase agreements. And when it comes to other, in terms of policy revisions and changes in its trade practices, I think China is making a lot of progress.
Klisman, I want to talk about something that we've seen during 2021, and that is the changing face of the workplace. In fact, it's the disappearance of the workplace. We've seen that many people now work from home. Many people who actually went home have not come back to work. How do you see the fallout from that change the workplace?
It depends on what industry you work in and how flexible your company is, because there are certain jobs in the service sector, if you're in construction, and physical things that you need to be out there and doing. And these things are vital for the continuation of our society, And these jobs are going to continue to be jobs you can't do from home.
Yeah.
But in the professional services, I think different companies have different policies on how they want to move forward for this. Naturally, you're not going to be able to capture, the human interaction through a camera. All the softwares are trying their best to mimic this.
Right.
I don't think it's going to be it's not going to be 2020 vision for that kind of thing. And in terms of financial fallout, I think it's hard to say. It's hard to say whether work from home is going to have a negative effect on the economy, because COVID will have a bigger one that will out-trump work from home any day.
Okay, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. We have run out of time. That is it for another edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu. Thanks for joining us.